Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Kate, for the introduction. Well, it's morning for me, and I'm at the tip of Africa here in Cape Town, where it's warming up and we're in spring at the moment, so things looking much happier. And if you can hear the chirping in the background, those are birds which are just outside my office. Just to talk about a little bit about my connection with Collins, I've kind of come into this via a series that I have been working on with other authors, which is a new series developed for the early years, for kindergarten. What I am going to be talking about today is the sort of thinking that in fact forms a basis for the development of the series, and the thinking is infused into the activities and learning program that it offers. Because we've only got an hour together, I'm going to select particular points that for me are close to my heart and I think very important. So I'm going to be focusing on those today. So you have a sort of little bit of a sense of me. Let's just focus a little bit and give you an opportunity. I'd just like to know a little bit more about you and sort of what your interest is really. So Kate, if you could maybe share the poll so that people can share a little bit about themselves. Okay. So what you need to do is you need to choose whether you are an early years teacher, a primary school teacher, or a head teacher or principal, or you have some other interest in joining us today.
It looks like we've got the majority of early years teachers. The poll is still being answered, so I'll give it a few minutes.
Okie dokes.
Yeah, lots of early years teachers today.
That's great. That's great.
Okay, I will share the results. No.
Okay. Well, that's great.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, let me hop right in then and start with what I find a really useful way of thinking about quality early education. Sorry, but there we go. So what I find really helpful in terms of thinking about it is this principle, which is something that Tina Bruce shares in her publication, Early Childhood Education. She's developed what she calls 10 transglobal principles of early education. And one of them focuses on what the components of quality education are for young children. And the key ones that she focuses on are the child and what the child brings into the learning situation, the context in which learning itself takes place, and then the knowledge and understanding that children develop and learn through engagement with activities. And very often in early years education as teachers, what we are called to focus on is what knowledge and understanding children are developing. And that takes up a lot of reporting time and focus time. And today what I want to do is just sort of step a little bit sideways and look at the child and the context in which learning takes place, and to think about some of the ingredients that both of these offer us as teachers in classrooms with young children. And just to note that obviously there is overlap between all of these three things, and particularly between child and context. So hopping right into context, I mean, we're all kind of aware that learning just doesn't happen in a vacuum, that there are different things that impact it. And so just to look at some of those, some which we're kind of often very conscious of, but others that sometimes just sort of slip from our view a little bit. Family is obviously a major impact on what children learn, because the family into which you are born affects everything from day one, including, for example, the first languages or the first language that you will learn and become competent in. And so that's the language that children will bring with them from home into school. The history of your family, the history of your country, the history of your community will all be things that affect what the adult generation decides is important for children to learn. So that will affect what children learn too. Where in the world children are born will affect what physical world they have to engage with, and also the natural environment that they're able to explore. And politics is a big influencer of what it is that children in early years learn. And sometimes one thinks about it as being very separate. But in most countries around the world, there's what is often called a trickle-down effect on what happens in early childhood education. For example, in South Africa, we have two sets of things that are political decisions that affect what happens in early years classrooms. One is a great need to improve the results of school leavers. And so each grade is asked to focus more and more on getting better results on their children, preparing them for the next grade, with the ultimate goal on improving school leaving results. And this trickles down grade by grade, right down into the earliest years of our schooling, what is called here our preschool years. The other thing that affects, the politics affects what goes on in early years classrooms is what the language of instruction is. This is, in our country, very much influenced by politics, because from the 4th year of schooling, children are expected to learn through the medium of either English or Afrikaans. And the majority of children in this country will have to switch to learning through English, even though it's not their home language. And so very often what happens is there's a pressure to start using English as the medium of instruction from early years. So these are some of the ways in which political decisions impact on the early years classrooms. Economics affects what children learn, because the opportunities that they are given will be affected by the number of options that are available to them through the wealth of their families. Society affects culturally the context into which children are born, and therefore the sorts of things that they are considered important to learn, and also a cultural understanding of childhood and what importance that is will affect the way that adults in the children's world interact with them. And then materials, resources, and knowledge. Whatever things are available to children will impact what it is possible for them to learn. And finally, a really important part, the child's very own physiology. And particularly here, I'm looking at the brain. The structure of the brain is the resource that children cannot help but bring to the party in terms of what's available for them to learn. So now let's just look a little bit more at the brain and how this impacts what we can do and what is available to us as early years teachers. This is a very simple drawing of the brain, and of course doesn't include all the complexities of it, but it focuses on the 3 parts that I want to look at that are really important for the work that we do in classrooms with young children. And then, you know, this is what the brain looks like now, but in evolutionary terms, our brains, as the human brain, is 2 million years old. So it's developed like this over time. And fortunately for us right now, means that children are born with all the equipment they need to do all the sorts of tasks that actually we require of them at school. In evolutionary terms, the oldest part of the brain is this part here called the brain stem, and then this part here, which is the cerebellum. The cerebrum here, this big part up here, is in evolutionary terms the more developed part of the brain. Comes later. So if we look at this in terms of the early years, the brain stem is the part of the brain that focuses on survival. It's the part of the brain that is focusing on our body functions, basic body functions like breathing, and also sending messages to and from the brain. And if this part of our brain could ask questions, could speak, it would be asking questions like, am I safe? What must I do to keep alive? So that's the part of the brain that is keeping our bodies alive. The next part that I want to focus on is this part over here called the limbic system. Now, it looks like it's on the surface of the brain, but actually the limbic system is made up of all sorts of structures that are deep inside the brain. So if this was a 3D model of it, you'd have to look inside to see the limbic system. And this collection of structures is very focused on emotion and on memory, on processing and regulating our emotions, and on forming and storing memories. So if this part was or these parts were going to be talking, they'd be asking questions like, am I loved? And they would be remembering what it actually feels like to be loved. And then the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that schooling often focuses very strongly on. It's the part that focuses on thinking, on the executive functions, which would be things like planning, on logical thinking, and on abstract thinking. So very much the business of schooling. And if this part of the brain was asking questions, it would be asking questions like, what can I learn from this situation? Or if what can I learn from this object? And all of these parts of the brains are obviously interconnected, and they are firing messages back and forth from one another at great speed, and this happens all completely unconsciously. So we have no sense of it whatsoever. But the really important thing to note is that all human behavior, and this includes learning because that's a human behavior, is based on the way in which our brains are structured. So in fact, our brains are completely wired for learning. It's not like we have to teach them to learn. They simply cannot help but learn. And so what would the things be that our brain would be focusing on, and what are the importance of this for the early years and what we do with children in classrooms? Well, with the brainstem focusing on survival, unless children are feeling safe and their physical needs are met, it's going to be very difficult for them to do the work of the prefrontal cortex, which is their logic and their abstract thinking. They're going to be bouncing between the work of the brainstem and the limbic system, and most of their energy is going to be focused there. So it's really important that children's very basic physical needs are met. And then the other things to note is that the brain comes with a set of primary emotional systems. So it's not like children are born and then they develop emotions later. Babies experience emotions right from the moment at birth. And then what happens throughout childhood and into adulthood, what they are doing is they're developing the ability to process and to regulate their emotions. But essentially, we are emotional beings. So we need to take that into account in our classrooms with young children. Also, that our brains are highly plastic and shaped by things that happen in the environment and experiences that we have. And this is like super good news for teachers, because what it means is that what we create in our classrooms, the atmosphere we create, the opportunities we offer children to explore, have an immense impact on the shaping, the physical shaping of children's brains. And then the other thing, which I think is really, really important to understand, is that our brains are actually wired it's actually wired to seek out and to recognize patterns and to make predictions. Sometimes what happens is we feel that we have to teach children these skills, but actually recent developments in neuroscience over the last decade have made it very clear that we come equipped as human beings to do these things. So what that releases us to do as to teachers is to not worry about we have to teach children how to do these things. What we need to do is to create situations and an environment and offer activities where children are able to use these things in practice as they play, as they learn, and so that they develop them. So all of this really means that if we're thinking about establishing context for learnings, that what we need to be doing is to focus on helping children to make meaningful connections. And I'll speak a little bit about how we do that a bit later, and about nurturing what is their natural curiosity. Our brains are just naturally curious about meaning. And if we focus on those two things, what we do is we create the possibility of learning. And, you know, children are naturally driven to make meaning. From the moment of birth, we are wired to make meaning from our environment. It's not something we have to be taught to do. We're trying to make sense of it all the time. And so what we can do is we can latch onto that potential and think about how to make meaningful connections for children so that they are able to make meaning. And so how would we do this? Here are some examples. So think about it. We could make connections to real life experiences of children. And these might be things that you have offered the child in the classroom before. So activities or experiences like outings that they've been on. You can talk about those things with children, make reference to them when you're introducing something new. Or what you can do is you can pick up on something that's happened in the classroom or outside in the playground, which has been unplanned, but you can make a connection to that with what it is that you're wanting to introduce to children. The other meaningful connections that we can make can be the home-school connections, which are really important. So drawing on children's experience out of school to make connections with what happens in the classroom. So for example, if you're wanting children to explore a topic around time, what you might be doing is referring to the kinds of experiences children have of routines at home, which signal the passing of time. So it's connecting with children's real lived experience of life and bringing it into the classroom. And then the other thing is to celebrate the everyday language that children bring into the classroom before offering them school way of saying things. So for example, if you're doing an activity, an action activity, a physical activity with children where you're wanting them to focus on different body parts, and you're doing a fun game where you're saying, copy me, pat your head, pat your shoulders, pat your chest, pat your tummy. Tummy would be an everyday word that English-speaking children use to refer to their stomachs. And then you can go, pat your tummy. Does anybody know another way of talking about your tummy? Is there another word for it? And then you can offer them the word stomach. And what that does is it helps to validate both the child's everyday language as well as introduce them to the more formal terms that we perhaps want them to use. So that's just some ideas around making meaningful connections. And what I want to do now is to just explore a little bit more about how to make connection through language, because the language that we use with children in the classroom is so critically important to their learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to just offer a quick couple of polls to think about some of the things around language and languages. So Kate, I think you're going to offer the polls now. So if people can answer each one of these. So how many languages did you learn at home before starting school? Was it one language? Or was it 2 languages, or 3 or more?
We've got lots of answers coming in. It looks like the majority are 2 languages at the moment. I'll leave it for a few more seconds.
That's amazing.
Here are the results. Still majority 2 languages.
Yeah.
There we go.
Great. And now to think a little bit about the languages that you use now in everyday life. How many languages you're using now. And so if you can answer this next poll, whether you use only 1 language now during your lives, or whether you use 2 languages or 3 or more languages. And this would be in every aspect of your life, not only in the classroom.
So this time it looks like the majority is 3 or more.
Mm-hmm.
Here are the results for you.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yes, 64% 3 or more.
Yeah. So very few people using only 1 language. And then finally, let's focus a little bit on language of instruction. So to think about the language of instruction in your classroom, at your school, whether this is the same as the children's mother tongue or home language, however you refer to it, whether it's the same for all of the children, whether it's the same for some of the children, or whether the language of instruction and the children's home languages are different for all of the children.
So it's pretty level pegging at the moment. It looks like the same for some of the children is pulling ahead right now, with different for all of the children just a little bit behind.
Okay.
So here are the results. So yes, 54%, the same for some of the children, 33% different for all of the children, and 13% the same for all of the children.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how low it is for same for all of the children.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for that. I mean, that's really useful. It's interesting because when I've shared some of this work with people in different contexts in South Africa and then across the continent, the sorts of results that we're seeing there are very much the kinds of results that we see across Africa as well. And what I want to do is to use that real life context to think about some of the language myths that exist and that very often education systems are built on. And the first one is that speaking only 1 language is the norm. And this is a myth that just is everywhere in the world. And it's so weird because we all know in terms of our lived experience, or most of us know, that this is simply not true, but we carry on, we arrange our systems as if this is the case. Whereas the majority of people globally are either bilingual or multilingual, just like shown in the surveys that we've done now, in the polls that we've done now. And it's not uncommon that it is English first language speakers that are monolingual, speak only 1 language. And this would be really just as a result of the dominance of English in the world, so that they're not really forced to learn other languages. They can choose to or not to. But what we need to realize is that there are huge gains to be had from being bilingual or multilingual. So it's something that we actually want to actively encourage in children. We don't want them to lose their ability in their home language as they learn other languages. Some of the gains, for example, around being bilingual and multilingual are that you have a much better understanding of how language and languages work, that you're able to switch between cognitive tasks much more easily and able to process information from the environment more easily. And then there's one which I kind of like to think about at my point in life, is that for much older people, those who land up getting dementia, if you are bilingual or multilingual, the chances are that you will retain many of your cognitive functions for longer if you have dementia and you are bilingual or multilingual. So these positives of being bilingual extend right the way through our lives. And so, you know, we really do need to, in our classrooms, provide opportunities for children to use their home languages as well as English or whatever the language of instruction is, so that they're using both and developing both language resources. The next language myth is this, is when you are teaching a child a new language, you should speak to them in only that language. And this is often called, if it's English, for example, it will be called English immersion. And I just want to take a side step away from that myth and think about it like growing tomatoes. If you plant two little seedlings, two tiny little plants in two different pots, because what you want to do is you want to actually have a crop of tomatoes because you need this resource. What you'll start to do is you'll obviously put them in the pots, put them out in the sun because they need the sunlight to grow, and then you'll water them. So you'll resource them with sunlight and you'll resource them with water. And so they'll start to grow. If you stop watering one of them, it will die. And the other one is not yet perhaps fully grown. So it's not producing the flowers and the fruit that you need to have your resource, to have your tomatoes. So you're at a stage where actually you have no tomatoes at all. And that sounds a great simplification, but it's very much like what happens if what we do is we cut off the opportunities for children to use the languages that they know and understand the best while they are acquiring another language. So we need to offer opportunities for children to continue to develop all their language resources, their home language, as well as the language of instruction at school. And some of the ways that we can do this is by, for example, asking parents to continue to speak to their children at home in their home languages about what children are learning at school, so that the child is getting that content spoken to about in both the language they are trying to acquire as well as the language that they know and understand the best. If you are able to use both the children's language and English, let's just say that's the language of instruction, then you can use both. You can read and tell stories in both. And when you are talking to children, perhaps about new topics, about information, then you can offer it in English first and then offer it in the children's language, or the other way around, so that they have the opportunity to hear the same thing in both languages. If you can't speak the children's language, and this was my situation because I had a classroom of 3 to 5 year olds where there was probably around about 7 or 8 home languages in the class. What I did was ask parents for key vocabulary terms, so that what I could do when I was talking about things was speak to the children in English and then to say, you know, so we call it moon and stars in English, and in your language, the words you use are this and that. So it just provides some hooks for children to grab onto, and then obviously using lots of visual stimulus, lots of pictures when talking about these things, because then that supports children acquiring the new language. So those are just some ideas how to navigate that situation. And then finally, the important thing, for a long time, the myth existed that languages are in separate bubbles in your brain. So a little bit like this. So you'd have your first language ability, your second language ability, and a third and fourth, depending on how many languages you speak. But you can see from that diagram that they're always quite separate. With the developments in neuroscience, we now understand that there's kind of like a resource for language in your brain. It's language. It's not separated out into different bits. And why this is significant for us is that you may often find that as children are acquiring a new language, they will use, even in one sentence, they'll use bits of the different language structures together, or they'll use some words from one language in a sentence with others. This is completely natural in terms of early learning and early child language development. And in fact, what you want to do is you want to encourage that rather than shut it down. Because eventually what happens is we learn to associate the use of particular languages with particular tasks that we perform. So, what we want to do is to encourage children in the early years in our classrooms to just use all the language resources that they have, both their home languages, perhaps in talking to friends and peers as they're working on activities, and then you using English and their languages where you can when you're speaking to them. So that's a little bit more about language. And what I want to focus now on, I'm terribly sorry, you can hear my dog in the background, is what I want to do is just to focus on play a little bit more. Sorry. So if you can just have a look at these two pictures, and we're going to put a poll up about this. And what I'd like you to do is to just focus on what you think the children are doing here. What are they doing? So if we can share the poll, are they engaged in fantasy or pretend play? Are they practicing using symbols? Would you describe it like that? They're practicing using symbols, or would you say they're doing both of those things?
So it's pretty level between fantasy or pretend play and both. Very little for just using symbols.
Okay. Right, so that's, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, for me, it is both, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is the case. Let's first just focus on the link between play and nurturing curiosity. Because play, in the very broadest sense of the word, is critical to nurturing children's natural curiosity, so their natural ability to learn. And I think most early years teachers would be aware, just in terms of their training, but also in terms of their experience of young children, that children really do use all of their senses to explore the world around them. And what that means is that what we need to do is we need to give them lots of hands-on practical opportunities to explore big concepts, so that they experience them through some of their senses all of the time. So, for example, just in the simple activity of children playing with objects in water, they're able to explore the scientific concepts of floating and sinking, of what properties materials have. Then in mathematical terms, we're able to explore with them capacity and volume. They're looking at how much of this goes into that. So thinking about capacity and volume. And then, of course, as they're talking to each other and we're speaking with them, we're giving them the language to capture the thinking about these very abstract concepts. Action rhymes are another thing that are used in early years settings across the globe. And these are wonderful opportunities for giving children richness of language that we don't have in everyday speech. It's a different kind of language to the one we use to communicate. But in absorbing the richness of the language, they're also absorbing the language that they need to think and talk about big concepts like change, like time of day, like the night sky as opposed to the sky during the daytime. So all of these very playful opportunities are in fact offering a context to children to explore, to problem solve, to express their creativity and to imagine. And the examples that we looked at in the slide before, in this slide, are examples of what we would call pretend or fantasy play. But they are more than that. They are also examples of what we call symbolic behavior. And I just want to focus on the importance of symbolic behavior very briefly. In order for children to do maths and science and reading and writing, they have to understand how symbols work. Now, it's not something that we're consciously thinking about when we are doing these things, but it's something that is in our subconscious, and we have to understand how these things work in order to read, write, and do maths effectively. For example, in order to read and write, you need to understand that this letter here, that symbol on the page, is a symbol for the sound N. And you have to know that this collection of letters here is the word nurturing. And that word is a symbol for something that you do. It's a written symbol for an action. So it stands in the place of an action. If you think of maths and you think of the number 2, that number, that numeral 2, is in fact a symbol for the quantity of 2 things. And you have to have that very base understanding of how symbol works in language and in maths in order to do these things. And children acquire this ability to do that through symbolic play, through pretend play. Because if you look at this picture here, you'll see that what the children are doing here is that they are using actions and an object to represent another action and another object. So the action that is being represented is the taking of a selfie with a mobile phone, and the flip-flop is representing for them the mobile phone. In the example that we had here before, the little girl is using the doll as a symbol for, as a representation of a baby. And the little cup is a representation. She's feeding the baby, so that is a symbol for the action. And likewise with this one, whereas there's a toy that's representing a real animal, there's stones and leaves in a plastic container which are representing food. So representing objects and representing the action of an animal feeding. And so these are really important. Sometimes pretend play is considered a nice to have, an extra that children can do once they finish with the real activities in the classroom. But it's very, very important for them to be able to have opportunities to use these things and to develop their understanding of the way in which symbol operates. Other opportunities for them to do this, other than through pretend play, would be through drawing, through painting, through dancing, through music, and then through role playing. But so play is a really important part of what it is that children do in classrooms, and so very critical to the things that they will do later in school. So often it's seen just as a nice to have. But it's very important that they're given these opportunities to explore the way in which symbol operates. And of course, to do so in a context in which they're able to make meaning from the activities for themselves. So that's really all I have to share with you today. And just really in summary to say that for me, it's that we want to think about developing children like we would young seedlings by providing a really rich environment and offering opportunities for them to engage so that we create possibilities for them. An environment in which children feel safe, both physically and emotional, so that they can take risks. And that we offer activities in which they are able to think and talk about their experiences, explore what things mean and how they work, deepen their understanding of concepts, build new knowledge, and very importantly, develop a bank of very positive memories when they think of learning and when they think of school. So I'm going to hand over now to Kate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arabella. That was brilliant. Yeah, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you for taking us through the presentation today. And just to let everyone know, our contact details are up on screen right now. So if you'd like to email us, it's collins.international@harpercollins.co.uk, or you can follow us on Twitter at collins_int and Facebook at collinsint. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending everyone who's attended today the webinar recording and the attendance certificate for you to refer back to. My colleague will now paste the link for the attendance certificate into the chat box as well if you'd like to download it now. And the recording will also be available on the webinar website. So that's www.collins.co.uk/webinars. If you have any queries at all, please feel free to contact us at the aforementioned email address. And yes, we're always here to help if you have any questions at all. So we've had a few questions through the Q&A box for the webinar today. Let me just see. So we've had from Toto in Indonesia. How should we teach children regarding economic, political, scientific, etc. subjects properly? So he said, I think that children of this age haven't developed the cognitive side of their brains enough yet to teach the subjects in depth. Would you suggest any techniques for more tricky subjects, Arabella?
So I mean, I think it's a really important point to think about because it really gets to the heart of what is appropriate content focus for young children. And I think that when we are freed up to allow children to explore what they are interested in a particular topic, we can worry less about what we should be inputting. So really and truly, big abstract concepts like geography, like politics, like history, are not yet conceptually where very young children are at. They're very interested in making sense of their surrounding world. So if we allow them to do that, that plants the seeds for the study of those things much later. If young children are not actually given ample opportunity to explore what is around them and what they have contact with every day, if they're not given the space to do that, the language to talk about those things, the language to think about those things, then what happens is when they do those things later on at school, that just becomes like book learning. They cannot connect with it anyway. So really, in the early years, it's very much a focus on experiencing what is around them, what is offered to them, primarily through using all of their 5 senses, and that will hook into that prefrontal lobe, will get their logic and their abstract thinking happening. So I would worry about those things later and focus on creating lots of opportunities for children to really explore, if you want a better term, the basics. So things like water, like change, like time. So those big concepts, like number. Yeah, so I would rather focus on those things.
Okay, thank you. We've also had from Shoba, is it okay to translate some lesson contents into the local language during early years teaching?
I think it is one of the best things that you can do. So because what it does is it enables children to have both. So you can use 2 languages. You can use the language that the children understand and start introducing the language of instruction. But translating into the children's home language, for me, and in terms of all the backing of the neuroscience, is exactly what is useful. You know, all the research shows that it takes children 6 years of schooling to be able to acquire the level of language needed in order to think and work in a new language. So while you're waiting for that to happen, while you are helping them to acquire that language, you need to be feeding the home language, and translating lesson content into the home language of the children is, of course, is the easiest, but the most skillful way of doing that.
Brilliant. So we've got another question from Namala, who has asked, do you recommend the use of technological devices for young children? So would they improve the students' learning or inhibit it?
So I think that sort of a 2-point response to that. I don't think that we should ban the use of technological devices, because they're part of our world, the world that we live in, and so children need to become familiar with them. What you need to think about is that technological devices do not allow children to explore things using all 5 of their senses. In fact, what they're doing is they're only using, usually, their visual. So I would offer experiences through the use of technological devices as one experience within the classroom, but certainly not the only. And if I had to choose, because you know, time was of the essence, or I didn't have a lot of access to technological devices, I would leave the technological devices to later on, if I had to choose between the 2. But I certainly do not think that it hurts at all, and is a nice variation to bring into the classroom if one has access to those things.
Brilliant, thank you. So someone has asked from the chat box a phonics question, I think. They've said, how do we explain English word formation for reading beyond phonics? So for example, how would you explain why face has a C and not an S?
Okay, so here's one of the real difficulties with teaching phonics in a language that the children don't actually speak fluently. When you're teaching phonics, what happens is children are drawing on their knowledge of a language to make meaning from what you're saying. So if children don't have enough real lived experience of a language, there's nothing to hook exactly the example you're talking about on. It's all meaningless. It's just like face means what, that symbol means what, how do you say it? It's just so totally confusing. So what I would do in a situation where one is having to teach English phonics in a classroom where children are not home language English speakers, is to offer the activities and see what happens, but just don't drill it. So just offer them as an experience, and as children, and to keep talking to children in English, and to give lots of rich input through rhymes, through songs, through stories, and that would be read stories and told stories, so that there's a lot of rich English language input that eventually children will start to hook onto the sorts of stuff that you're doing in phonics to link in with that. But I would not hammer it until they've got it, because those two bits will come together at the point at which the child's language development in the new language is sufficient. So I would just keep offering the phonics stuff as language experiences, but do the other very rich language input in order to provide a support and a connection between those two things.
Thank you. So we've got a couple more questions. Someone's asked, so they've said, preparing children for primary is our most important task, so there isn't a lot of time for children to play. And Toto has also said in some settings, in some schools, pretend play is not necessarily encouraged. So they've said, I don't see how I could allow more time for children just to play. Do you have any tips for this, please?
Okay, so one of the things that we need to do is to release ourselves from thinking about play that is something separate to learning. Play just happens to be the term we use for children who are in the process of exploring and learning. So play happens when children are doing creative activities. They're learning physical skills, they're learning about what materials feel like, as they're perhaps doing, if you think of a collage activity, when they're pasting different materials down. They're exploring what they feel like. Are they shiny? They're learning the vocabulary to think and talk about these things. So those activities are, and often people would call those play activities. So play, there's actually a huge opportunity throughout the day for children to explore in this way, and that is very broadly what is called play. In terms of opportunities for pretend play, there are things that you can do, obviously to create an area in your classroom where it's possible for children to pretend. And you can link this to real things that you are teaching in other areas of your curriculum. So for example, you can put writing materials, so little notepads, little pencils, into a play area if you're wanting children to think about how we use writing when they go to the clinic or the hospital, because then doctors can write prescriptions, people can write appointment cards. In shops, they can, you can create place for children to always write and draw, so that they're using symbol. So if you've been dealing perhaps with money and maths, what they can be doing is they can be making little coins and making notes. And all of these things provide opportunities. That's play. But actually they're exploring money, they're exploring how symbol works, because they're creating this little banknote which represents a real banknote, and then they play with it. So I know that it's hard, and I know that sometimes it's, pretend play is frowned upon, but it really is incredibly important. And I would urge you to share with people the way in which it's important for symbolic behavior development and how that's important for reading, writing, and maths. So to share that both with parents and other teachers in the school so that they understand its value.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So Thomas Tan has also asked, is technological pedagogical content knowledge needed in teaching early years students? So I think the TPAC abbreviation.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I am not familiar with that. That's not something that we use in South Africa, so I'm not familiar with that. But yeah, so I'm not really sure what that refers to. Are you able to, yeah, some more information?
So Thomas, if you can elaborate in the Q&A box, that would be brilliant. So we've also had another question from Dilly. How important are sight words in language, especially if the school environment is surrounded by the home language?
Okay, so that's really teaching children how to be bilingual. Environmental print is, as you're indicating, incredibly important in terms of children learning to recognize particular words. And you know, you can do this. I would do this in the classroom by labeling different things in both languages. So both the language that the children are familiar with, as well as the language that you're wanting them to acquire, which is the language of instruction, so English perhaps. You know, you can use labels. So everything you do can use both of those labels. So for example, if you have a weather chart, you have the words weather in both languages. If you're talking to children about hard and soft objects, you can spend some time going, okay, let's put some labels on all the hard things in our classroom and leave those labels up for a little while so that they can enjoy them. So you'd put one on door, you'd put one on window, and you'd use both of those languages. And I would use different colors to differentiate between the two. Yeah, so I would just use, to create environmental print. The other thing is to put up, to make your own posters of rhymes popular rhymes that you sing with the children. So for example, I don't know if you use Happy Birthday. So very often there are different, people sing that in different languages, but they're using the same tune. So to write that up and to put those up in both languages so that you're creating environmental print, and children will extract sight words from those things. So it's again about creating a context which is rich for the children, a rich language context for the children to draw on.
Great. Thank you, Arabella. So I think that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to just thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this useful. And thank you, Arabella, for your presentation. It was brilliant. And I know from the chat box, a lot of people have been singing your praises. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.